Puree. Sydney, November 1869. Clancy. The harbour sang with sunlight. The seagulls danced. Even the smoke from the steamship's funnels seemed to waltz as Horatio Clancy cuffed the urchin trying to pick his pocket on the crowded wharf, then stared at the young woman gazing anxiously at the faces of those who waited on the wharf as she stood among the other first-class passengers on deck. It was love at first sight. This was convenient. The marriage had been arranged a year earlier, across 6,000 miles. The Honourable Flora Macpherson, daughter of Lord Angus Macpherson and Lady Angus, of Buccleuch Abbey, Northumberland, to wed Mr. Horatio Clancy, only son of Mr. Ezekiel Clancy of Overflow, in the colony of New South Wales, and his wife Mary, deceased. The notice did not mention that Ezekiel Clancy had been transported more than 40 years before for stealing 12 bags of turnip seed, nor that his wife had been an Irish orphan, taught cookery and scrubbing by the nuns, then sent as a child to earn her keep in the colony of Australia, where men outnumbered women perhaps 40 to 1, and a talent for cookery, or even scrubbing, was rare. Flora's red hair flamed like sunrise. Her dress and sunshade glowed immaculately white. Even though he had only seen a miniature of her painted by her aunt, the Honourable Flora Macpherson was unmistakable. She still looked so very young, and she was his. Clancy knew the moment when Flora saw him too. He lifted his top hat so she could see his face more clearly. She smiled, a look of total joy, and he knew that somehow, miraculously, at the first sight of him, tall, tanned, dressed in his frock coat and waistcoat, she felt the bond between them too. He felt a sudden deep gratitude to Maria, who had assiduously perused English magazines, so his tailor could be given the exact patterns for the latest in gentlemen's apparel. The waves splashed, and the wharf creaked under the waiting crowd, mostly ex-convicts in faded drab, watching for families they had not seen for the decades it had taken to save enough to bring them across the world. Of course, the steerage passengers would not be allowed on deck until the first-class passengers had disembarked. Clancy watched as Flora turned to give instructions to the black-clad woman who held the parasol over her head. That must be Sarah, her maid. If the sky fell now, he thought, he would still be smiling. Not just at the sight of Flora, but from knowing he had at last achieved his father's ambition. The grandchildren of Ezekiel Clancy, ex-convict, would be aristocrats. Ezekiel had endured a long journey to this marriage, saving enough for a mob of drought-thinned sheep back in the dry 1840s, when you could buy a barren holding for the cost of a pair of trousers, herding the creatures across the mountains, half of them dying on the way, finally following the track of Cecil Drinkwater, who'd persuaded a native girl to show him where a river ran, despite the drought. Drinkwater had politely suggested Ezekiel keep moving his mob downriver, beyond his own claim, to the Overflow, a plain below the hills with a dozen channels where moisture seeped even in the dry times, and the river filled every time it flooded. In an uncharacteristic burst of imagination, Ezekiel named it Overflow. Ezekiel grew rich when gold was found nearby, selling mutton to the miners of Gibbers Creek. The rush soon ended, but Overflow grew wealthier with the British demand for wool to make uniforms for the Crimea. Finally, the influence of squatters with far better connections than Ezekiel Clancy, but with similar vast fortunes from the high prices for wool and mutton, had ensured he and they legally owned the vast estates they claimed. Ezekiel planned a dynasty. His son would be a gentleman. His granddaughters would be presented by their aristocratic relatives to the Queen. The gangplank was secured. Clancy waited, top hat in hand, as the passengers slowly made their way down to the wharf, followed by maids and valets carrying portmanteaus. Their heavy trunks would be delivered later. His gaze was not able to move away from her. A delicacy, The vividness